The story begins in a way that seems simple enough at first glance. Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain killed Abel out of jealousy, and God banished him to wander the earth as punishment. End of story, right? Wrong. Because what happens next in Genesis chapter 4 has puzzled theologians, biblical scholars, and everyday Bible readers for literally thousands of years. When Cain arrives in the land of Nod, something absolutely shocking occurs. He immediately finds a wife, gets married, and builds an entire city. Wait a minute. If there were only 3 people left on earth at this point, Adam, Eve, and Cain, then who exactly did Cain marry? Better yet, who helped him build that city? Genesis 4:16-17 explicitly states, "Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city." But here's where it gets even more intriguing and, frankly, more disturbing if you really think about it. Just a few verses earlier, in Genesis 4:14, Cain himself reveals something that should make us all stop and scratch our heads. After God pronounces judgment on him, Cain cries out, "Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. Anyone who finds me. Anyone, not my parents might kill me, or my future siblings might kill me." And here's the detail that almost nobody talks about. God himself acknowledges that Cain's fear is legitimate. In Genesis 4:15, God responds to Cain's concern by saying, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And then God puts a mark on Cain specifically to protect him from these other people. Let that sink in. God didn't say, "Don't worry, Cain, there's nobody out there to hurt you." He didn't dismiss Cain's fear as irrational. Instead, he validated it by providing supernatural protection against these unnamed individuals. Over the centuries, theologians and Bible scholars have proposed several theories to explain this Cain mystery. And if you've ever asked a pastor or Sunday school teacher about it, you've probably heard at least one of these explanations. The most common theory is that Cain married one of his sisters who isn't mentioned in the text. After all, Genesis 5-4 does say that Adam had other sons and daughters, so problem solved, right? Well, not exactly. Because when you actually dig into the timeline and do the math, this theory starts falling apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Let's break down why this popular explanation just doesn't hold water. First, let's talk about the timeline issue that nobody seems to want to address. According to Genesis 5-3, Seth was born when Adam was 130 years old, and Seth was born after Abel's death as a replacement for him. This means that the murder of Abel and the banishment of Cain happened sometime before Adam turned 130. Now, even if we're generous and assume that Abel was killed when Adam was, say, 100 years old, and even if we assume that Adam and Eve were having children constantly during that time, we're still talking about maybe 3 or 4 generations at most. That's not nearly enough people to populate a city, let alone create the fear in Cain that anyone who found him would kill him. But here's where it gets even more problematic with the sister theory. The text describes Abel as a young shepherd and Cain as a young farmer when the murder occurs. These aren't descriptions of men who are 80 or 90 years old with dozens of siblings and hundreds of nieces and nephews running around. These are relatively young men in the early stages of their lives. If Cain had grown up surrounded by a massive extended family of brothers, sisters, cousins, and so on, the text would likely reflect that reality. Instead, the narrative treats Cain and Abel as if they're part of a small, intimate family unit, not a sprawling clan that had already multiplied across the earth for decades. Now, some scholars propose a second theory, that there were rapid generations of multiplication that the Bible simply doesn't mention in detail. They argue that maybe decades or even a century passed between the verses, and during that time, Adam and Eve's descendants multiplied exponentially. But this creates even more problems than it solves. If there were already hundreds or thousands of people on earth by the time Cain killed Abel, why does the text treat this as such an intimate family tragedy? Why doesn't it mention any of these other people during the Cain and Abel narrative? And most importantly, if all these people were Cain's relatives, why was he so afraid they'd kill him? The third common theory is that we shouldn't take Genesis literally at all, that it's purely symbolic or allegorical, and we're not supposed to worry about these details. But this approach creates massive theological problems. Jesus himself referred to Adam and Eve as historical figures. Paul bases his entire theology of sin and redemption in Romans 5 on Adam being a literal, historical person. If we dismiss Genesis as mere mythology, we undermine the foundation of core Christian doctrines. Plus, this theory is really just giving up rather than actually answering the question. It's like saying, I can't solve this puzzle, so I'm going to pretend it's not a real puzzle. That's not scholarship, that's surrender. Here's where things get absolutely fascinating and honestly, a bit mind-blowing. The key to unlocking this entire mystery has been sitting right there in the original Hebrew text of Genesis for thousands of years, but most English translations completely obscure it. The Hebrew language uses two different terms when referring to man in the early chapters of Genesis, and this distinction is absolutely crucial. In Genesis 1:26-27, the text uses the term ha-Adam, which is a generic collective term meaning mankind or humanity in general. But in Genesis 2-7, when God forms a specific individual from the dust, the text uses Adam without the article ha, indicating a proper name, a specific person with a special purpose. Let's look at what Genesis 1:26-27 actually says in the Hebrew context. Then God said, "Let us make man, Adam, in our image, according to our likeness." So God created man, Adam, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Notice that? Male and female. He created them plural. Not a single couple, but humanity as a whole. Then God tells them to be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth. The word fill is crucial here. You don't tell two people to fill the earth. That verb implies there's already a substantial population being commissioned to spread out and occupy the planet. Now contrast that with Genesis 2-7, which describes something much more specific and intimate. And the Lord God formed man, Adam, of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. This isn't describing the creation of humanity in general. This is describing the creation of one specific individual named Adam, formed in a particular place, the Garden of Eden, for a particular purpose. Hebrew scholars have recognized this distinction for centuries. The Talmud and various midrashic texts discuss these nuances extensively. This isn't some modern, fringe interpretation. It's an ancient understanding that got lost in translation when the Bible was rendered into Greek, Latin, and eventually English. Think about it this way. Genesis 1 is giving us the big picture: God creating humanity across the earth on the sixth day of creation. Genesis 2 zooms in on one specific family line, one particular man formed for a covenant relationship with God, placed in a special garden, given a unique role as the father of the messianic line. It's like watching a movie that starts with a wide aerial shot of a city, then zooms in to focus on one specific house on one specific street. Both are true. Both are real. They're just different levels of detail focusing on different aspects of the same reality. The Bible does this all the time. It's a common Hebrew literary technique called recapitulation. Here's the practical application of understanding this. When Cain says, "Anyone who finds me will kill me," he's not talking about his siblings. He's talking about the general human population, the Adam, that God created in Genesis 1. When Cain goes to Nod and finds a wife, he's meeting descendants of that general creation. When he builds a city, he's interacting with an already established population. This explains everything. It explains his fear. It explains the wife. It explains the city. It explains why God put a protective mark on him, because he was going out into a world already populated by people who weren't part of his immediate family, people who had their own societies, their own rules, their own kings and structures of governance. Now that we understand the Hebrew distinction between general humanity and Adam's specific lineage, let's look at what else the Bible reveals about these other populations. Genesis 4:15 tells us that God put a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. But here's what's really interesting. God doesn't just acknowledge that other people exist. He acknowledges that they have a moral and social system already in place. The mark serves as a warning to these other people that killing Cain would result in divine judgment. This implies that these populations understood concepts of justice, revenge, and divine authority. You don't create a warning system for people who don't exist or who don't have the capacity to understand moral consequences. Then we get to Genesis 4:17, and the text casually drops this bombshell. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Let's pause here and think about what building a city actually requires. You need urban planners, architects, construction workers, farmers to feed everyone, craftsmen, administrators, and a substantial population to actually live in and govern the city. Archaeological evidence shows that even ancient cities required populations in the thousands to function properly. Where did all these people come from if Cain only had his parents back home? The only logical answer is that Cain recruited, employed, or collaborated with people who were already living in the land of Nod. But it gets even more interesting when we look at Cain's descendants and their rapid technological advancement. Genesis 4:19-22 introduces us to Lamech's sons, Jabal, who became the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, Jubal, who became the father of all those who play the harp and flute, and Tubal-Cain, who was an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Think about what this means. Within just a few generations of Cain's line, we see the development of organized pastoralism, musical arts and instrument crafting, and advanced metallurgy including both bronze and iron working. These aren't simple skills you figure out overnight. They require extensive knowledge, experimentation, teaching, and cultural transmission across populations. Here's where the Bible reveals something that most people completely miss: the existence of the Nephilim and other distinct races. Genesis 6:4 states, "There were giants, Nephilim, on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. That phrase, "and also afterward," is absolutely crucial. It indicates that the Nephilim already existed before the union between the sons of God and daughters of men. They weren't created by that union, they were already there. Later, in Numbers 13:33, we see that Nephilim appeared again after the flood. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. The Bible consistently acknowledges multiple races and populations throughout the Old Testament. The Old Testament mentions several distinct races that the Israelites encountered. The Rephaim, Deuteronomy 2:11-20, the Anakim, Numbers 13:33, the Emim, Deuteronomy 2:10-11, and the Zamzummim, Deuteronomy 2:20. These weren't just different tribes, they were recognized as physically distinct peoples, often described as giants or people of extraordinary stature. King Og of Bashan, for instance, had a bed that was 13 feet long, Deuteronomy 3:11. The Bible treats these as historical facts, not mythology. This consistent pattern throughout Scripture suggests that God's creative work was far more diverse and extensive than a simple reading of Genesis 2 might suggest. Adam's line was special chosen for the messianic purpose, but it wasn't necessarily the only line that existed on earth. When we step back and look at the archaeological evidence, something remarkable happens. The physical evidence actually confirms what the Hebrew text has been telling us all along. Take Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, for example. This massive temple complex has been dated to approximately 9,600 BC, making it older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and older than the pyramids by about 7,000 years. Here's what's absolutely stunning. Göbekli Tepe was built before the development of agriculture, before the invention of writing, before pottery, before metal tools. Yet somehow, a sophisticated society organized thousands of workers to quarry, transport, carve, and erect massive stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, decorated with intricate carvings of animals and symbols. This wasn't a primitive tribe scratching out survival. This was an organized civilization with advanced planning capabilities, social hierarchy, and shared religious purpose. The Sumerian civilization offers even more fascinating parallels to the Genesis account. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents ever discovered, records kings who reigned for impossibly long periods before a great flood, some supposedly ruling for tens of thousands of years. While we can dismiss the extreme numbers as mythological exaggeration, the pattern is strikingly similar to Genesis. Extremely long lifespans before the flood, followed by a catastrophic deluge, followed by more normal lifespans afterward. The Sumerians also had detailed accounts of creation, the mixing of divine and human bloodlines, and advanced pre-flood civilizations. These aren't just random myths, they're cultural memories preserved by different people groups describing the same ancient reality. The fact that cultures separated by thousands of miles tell similar stories suggests they're all remembering actual historical events. Now let's put all the pieces together into a coherent timeline that honors both scripture and evidence. In Genesis 1, God creates humanity, Adam, in general across the earth on the sixth day, male and female, with the command to multiply and fill the earth. This is the broad creation of humankind. Then, in Genesis 2, God performs a specific special act. He forms Adam from the dust, breathes into him the breath of life in a unique way, places him in the Garden of Eden, and establishes a covenant relationship with him. Adam becomes the head of a particular lineage, the messianic line through which redemption would eventually come. When Adam and Eve fall, their sin affects their descendants and the redemptive plan, but it doesn't necessarily affect all of humanity everywhere. Cain is then banished into a world already populated by the general creation from Genesis 1. This interpretation doesn't contradict any essential Christian doctrine. In fact, it strengthens them. Romans 5 and 1 Corinthians 15 describe Adam as the federal head of redeemed humanity, the first man in the covenant line, the one through whom sin entered the world for his descendants. Jesus called the second Adam because he reverses what the first Adam did for those in the covenant. This doesn't require Adam to be the only human who ever existed. It requires him to be the covenantal head of the line that leads to Christ. Think of it like this: Abraham is called the father of faith and the one through whom all nations would be blessed. But Abraham wasn't the only person alive in his time. He was chosen for a specific purpose within an already populated world. Adam's role is similar, but earlier chosen as the father of the redemptive line. The beauty of this interpretation is that it answers every question while maintaining biblical authority and theological integrity. Why did Cain fear being killed? Because he was entering territories populated by people outside his family. Where did his wife come from? From the general human population created in Genesis 1. How could he build a city so quickly? Because there was already an established population to work with. Why does the Bible mention Nephilim, giants, and other distinct races? Because God's creation was diverse and extensive. Why does archaeology show advanced civilizations so early? Because humanity had been developing for longer than a simple reading of Genesis 2 alone might suggest. This isn't contradiction, it's completion. It's seeing the full picture that the Hebrew text has been painting all along. A picture where God's creative work is even more magnificent, more complex, and more purposeful than we ever imagined. The land of Nod wasn't empty. It was teeming with life, culture, and civilization, all part of God's grand design.